Hello. Hello, hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing on with Hunchback of Notre-Dame by Victor Hugo, starting with part 2, book 8th, chapter 4. But first, reading updates. I have been listening to A Darker Shade of Magic by V. Schwab, and unknowingly when I started it, it is a trilogy. I thought it was just going to be like one of her one-off stories, but it's not. So I finished it. I enjoyed it enough to keep going on. And I yeah, I finished it. That's all I have to say. It was good. It's about this world where there are multiple Londons, like in different dimensions, and they are categorized based on the level of magic that is in their world. And our main character is named Kel, and he is Antari, which means he is a magician, and he does blood magic and all of these things. And he is able to travel between all of the different Londons, and he has made a living out of smuggling magical objects into other worlds for people who are either enthusiasts and just like collectors and those types of things, but then also people who are just convinced that they're magical, whether or not they actually are, or have any power at all. And then our other main character is Delilah, and she is a pickpocket. She's a thief, and their worlds sort of well, they don't sort of, they definitely intertwine, and chaos ensues, and it's great. And I was wondering when I listened to it on audio, also the voice actor, it was great. But I was wondering if it was going to, once I learned that it was a series, if the current story was going to be wrapped up in the first book, or if it was like, this is our long arching story. Um, and I'm not going to tell you because it's a spoiler, but I did find out because I finished the book. Yeah, and I have 5 books in transit for me to pick up from the library. That is far too many books. Although, to be fair, like 3 of them, yeah, 3 of them are poetry books. So we'll see. Because I was like, oh, you know what? It's poetry month, and I don't really read a lot of poetry. So I put like 6 poetry books on hold. Why? I don't know. But 3 of them are on their way. And then I have Divine Rivals is on its way, and that was the winner of the Goodreads Choice Awards for 2023 for something. I don't remember what. And then I also have a chat recommendation that's on the way. So, all exciting things today. We are continuing on with The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. And what happened last time? Terrible things. Terrible things happened last time. My gosh. Are we ready to be upset so early in the day? Because we're about to be. Okay, so Esmeralda has been um arrested because she's been accused of witchcraft and, being a witch and being in cahoots with the devil and all of these things, but also with killing the like head guardsman of the king, Phoebus. And that's not what happened. That's not what happened. What actually happened was creepy Claude Frollo was in this like little hidey hole nook of and was able to see Esmeralda and Phoebus as they were like about to like have an intimate night together. But he like bursted out and then stabbed Phoebus several times and then flung himself out the window. Safely he like landed in the river. He's fine. We're not worried about him. But the innkeeper comes up and sees like just the room covered in blood and Phoebus laying there and Esmeralda pretending to be dead. And then the coin that was used to pay for the room has been turned into a dead leaf when really like there was a small child who was also in the inn and switched it out. So he like grabbed the coin and switched it for a dead leaf. So she's been accused of all of these things and she's been denying it because she didn't do anything. And they're like, well, the court is like, well, I guess we have to do some questioning. So then they take her into the questioning room, which is just a torture chamber, and the like head torturer and his interns are like looking through all of these terrible equipment and tools and everything for their job. And the is he the auditor? Who is he? I don't know who he is, but Jacques is like, "Oh, like are you still in denial of the crimes that you've committed?" And she's like, "I didn't do anything." And they're like, "All right, well, get the boot." And so they like strap her to this table and like do all these things. And then immediately, as soon as like the torture starts happening, she cries out saying that she did it. Like she admits to everything. And so Jacques like has her released. Like her foot is badly damaged, which is terrible because she's a street performer. Like she dances for a living, and she is just like broken inside. And so he's going through the charges and is just like, "Do you worship Baphomet?" And she's like, "Yes." And she's like, is your goat actually your familiar?" And there's like a little demon inside. And she's like, "Yes." It's like, did you actually do this? And so she just keeps admitting all of the things that she did, which she really didn't. And then they go back out into the court and they're like, "Well, she admitted everything." And then her lawyer stands up. Apparently, she had a lawyer. And her lawyer stands up and is like, "Well, actually, according to the law, like, she should really have to pay a fine." And they were like, "Okay, here's what's going to happen. Actually, before we give our thing, we can't do this because there's a demon here in our midst." And they're like, "What are you talking about?" And they point, and her little goat is there. And the little goat who's been trained to do these tricks, like, and one of them is an imitation of Jacques, like, points back. And so they're like, "Oh my gosh, the devil." And then there's like little, like, lettered tiles and the goat spells out Phoebus's name, and they like ask like what time it is, and the goat's like tapping the time like with his little hoof, and it's just so sad. So the punishment for both of them, Esmeralda has to like stand before the like palace of justice and apologize, and then she's going to be tortured and then hanged, and then the goat is gonna be hanged. I don't like that. I don't like that. And Gringoire, who is married to her, who we met a long time ago. He was like the director of the play at the very beginning for the Feast of the Fools, and he is now married to Esmeralda because of circumstances that are just far too long to get into right now. And he is there for like the public court, and he's like, "Wait a minute, that's Esmeralda. She's been missing for like a month and nobody had found her. And it's because she's being held." And so I think that's everything that we need to know. I think. Yeah. Oh, and she is just like in complete shock. So she hasn't like fully comprehended everything that is actually happening. Here we go. Chapter 4. Lasciate agni speranza. Leave all hope behind, ye who enter. In the Middle Ages, when an edifice was complete, there was almost as much of it in the earth as above it, unless built upon piles, like Notre-Dame. A palace, a fortress, a church, had always a double bottom. In cathedrals it was, in some sort, another subterranean cathedral, low, dark, mysterious, blind, and mute, under the upper nave, which was overflowing with light and reverberations with organs and bells day and night. Sometimes it was a sepulchre, In palaces, a fortress. In fortresses, it was a prison. Sometimes a sepulchre also. Sometimes both together. These mighty buildings, whose mode of formation and vegetation we have elsewhere explained, had not simply foundations, but, so to speak, roots which ran branching through the soil in chambers, galleries, and staircases, like the construction above. Thus, churches, palaces, fortresses had the earth halfway up their bodies. The cellars of an edifice formed another edifice, into which one descended instead of ascending, and which extended its subterranean grounds under the external piles of the monument, like those forests and mountains which are reversed in the mirror-like waters of a lake, beneath the forests and mountains of the banks. At the fortress of Saint Antoine, at the Palace of Justice of Paris, at the Louvre, these subterranean edifices were prisons. The stories of these prisons, as they sank into the soil, grew constantly narrower and more gloomy. They were so many zones where the shades of horror were graduated. Dante could never imagine anything better for his hell. These tunnels of cells usually terminated in a sack of a lowest dungeon, with a vat-like bottom, where Dante placed Satan, where society placed those condemned to death. A miserable human existence, once interred there. Farewell light, air, life, ogni speranza, every hope. It only came forth to the scaffold or the stake. Sometimes it rotted there. Human justice called this forgetting. Between men and himself, the condemned man felt a pile of stones and jailers weighing down upon his head, and the entire prison, the massive Bastille, was nothing more than an enormous, complicated lock, which barred him off from the rest of the world. It was in a sloping cavity of this description, in the oblettes excavated by Saint Louis, in the in-pace of the Tournelle, and that La Esmeralda had been placed on being condemned to death, through fear of her escape, no doubt, with the colossal courthouse over her head. Poor fly! Who could not have lifted even one of its blocks of stone? Assuredly, Providence and society had been equally unjust. Such an excess of unhappiness and of torture was not necessary to break so frail a creature. There she lay, lost in the shadows, buried, hidden, immured. Anyone who could have beheld her in this state, after having seen her laugh and dance in the sun, would have shuddered. Cold as night, cold as death. Not a breath of air in her tresses, not a human sound in her ear, no longer a ray of light in her eyes, snapped in twain, crushed with chains, crouching beside a jug and a loaf on a little straw in a pool of water, which was formed under her by the sweating of the prison walls, without motion, almost without breath. She had no longer the power to suffer. Phoebus, the sun, midday, the open air, the streets of Paris, the dances with applause, the sweet babblings of love with the officer, then the priest, the old crone, the poignard, the blood, the torture, the gibbet. All this did, indeed, pass before her mind, sometimes as a charming and golden vision, sometimes as a hideous nightmare. But it was no longer anything but a vague and horrible struggle, lost in the gloom, or distant music played up above ground, and which was no longer audible at the depth where the unhappy girl had fallen. Since she had been there, she had neither waked nor slept. In that misfortune, in that cell, she could no longer distinguish her waking hours from slumber, dreams from reality, any more than day from night. All this was mixed, broken, floating, disseminated confusedly in her thought. She no longer felt. She no longer knew. She no longer thought. At the most, she only dreamed. Never had a living creature been thrust more deeply into nothingness. This benumbed, frozen, petrified. She had barely noticed on 2 or 3 occasions the sound of a trapdoor opening somewhere above her, without even permitting the passage of a little light, and through which a hand had tossed her a bit of black bread. Nevertheless, this periodical visit of the jailer was the sole communication which was left her with mankind. A single thing still mechanically occupied her ear. Above her head, the dampness was filtering through the moldy stones of the vault, and a drop of water dropped from them at regular intervals. She listened stupidly to the noise made by this drop of water as it fell into the pool beside her. This drop of water, falling from time to time into that pool, was the only movement which still went on around her, the only clock which marked the time, the only noise which reached her of all the noise made on the surface of the earth. To tell the whole, however, she also felt, from time to time, in that cesspool of mire and darkness, something cold passing over her foot or her arm, and she shuddered. How long had she been there? She did not know. She had a recollection of a sentence of death pronounced somewhere, against someone, then of having been herself carried away, and of waking up in darkness and silence, chilled to the heart. She had dragged herself along on her hands. Then iron rings that cut her ankles, and chains had rattled. She had recognized the fact that all around her was wall, that below her there was a pavement covered with moisture and a truss of straw, but neither lamp nor air hole. Then she had seated herself on that straw, and sometimes, for the sake of changing her attitude, on the last stone step in her dungeon. For a while she had tried to count the black minutes measured off for her by the drop of water, but that melancholy labor of an ailing brain had broken off of itself in her head, and had left her in stupor. At length, one day, or one night, for midnight and midday were all the same color in that sepulchre, she heard above her a louder noise than was usually made by the turnkey when he brought her bread and jug of water. She raised her head, and beheld a ray of reddish light passing through the crevices in the sort of trapped door contrived in the roof of the impasse. At the same time, the heavy lock creaked. The trap grated on its rusty hinges, turned, and she beheld a lantern, a hand, and the lower portions of the bodies of 2 men, the door being too low to admit of her seeing their heads. The light pained her so acutely that she shut her eyes. When she opened them again, the door was closed. The lantern was deposited on one of the steps of the staircase. A man alone stood before her. A monk's black cloak fell to his feet. A cowl of the same color concealed his face. Nothing was visible of his person, neither face nor hands. It was a long, black shroud standing erect, and beneath which something could be felt moving. She gazed fixedly for several minutes at this sort of spectre, but neither he nor she spoke. One would have pronounced them 2 statues confronting each other. 2 things only seemed alive in that cavern: the wick of the lantern, which sputtered on account of the dampness of the atmosphere, and the drop of water from the roof, which cut this irregular sputtering with its monotonous splash, and made the light of the lantern quiver in concentric waves on the oily water of the pool. At last, the prisoner broke the silence. "Who are you?" "A priest." The words, the accent, the sound of his voice made her tremble. The priest continued in a hollow voice, "Are you prepared?" "For what?" "To die." "Oh, said she. Will it be soon? Tomorrow. Her head, which had been raised with joy, fell back upon her breast. 'Tis very far away yet, she murmured. Why could they not have done it today? Then you are very unhappy? Asked the priest, after a silence. I am very cold, she replied. She took her feet in her hands, a gesture habitual with unhappy wretches who are cold, as we have already seen in the cases of the recluse of the Tor Roland, and her teeth chattered. The priest appeared to cast his eyes around the dungeon from beneath his cowl. Without light, without fire, in the water, it is horrible. Yes, she replied with the bewildered air which unhappiness had given her. The day belongs to everyone. Why do they give me only night? Do you know, resumed the priest after a fresh silence, why you are here? I thought I knew once, she said, passing her thin fingers over her eyelids as though to aid her memory. But I know no longer. All at once she began to weep like a child. I should like to get away from here, sir. I am cold. I am afraid. And there are creatures which crawl over my body. Well, follow me. So saying, the priest took her arm. The unhappy girl was frozen to her very soul, yet that hand produced an impression of cold upon her. Oh, she murmured, 'tis the icy hand of death. Who are you? The priest threw back his cowl. She looked. It was the sinister visage which had so long pursued her, that demon's head which had appeared at Falordel's above the head of her adored Phoebus, that eye which she last had seen glittering beside a dagger. This apparition, always so fatal for her, and which had thus driven her on from misfortune to misfortune, even to torture, roused her from her stupor. It seemed to her that the sort of veil which had lain thick upon her memory was rent away. All the details of her melancholy adventure, from the nocturnal scene at La Balordel's to her condemnation to the Tournelle, recurred to her memory, no longer vague and confused as heretofore, but distinct, harsh, clear, palpitating terror. These souvenirs, half effaced and almost obliterated by excess of suffering, were revived by the somber figure which stood before her, as the approach of fire causes letters traced upon white paper with invisible ink to start out perfectly fresh. It seemed to her that all the wounds of her heart opened and bled simultaneously. Huh? She cried, with her hands on her eyes and a convulsive trembling. 'Tis the priest! Then she dropped her arms in discouragement and remained seated, with lowered head, eyes fixed on the ground, mute and still trembling. The priest gazed at her with the eye of a hawk, which has long been soaring in a circle from the heights of heaven over a poor lark cowering in the wheat, and has long been silently contracting the formidable circles of his flight, and has suddenly swooped down upon his prey like a flash of lightning, and holds it panting in his talons. She began to murmur in a low voice, "Finish, finish, the last blow," and she drew her head down in terror between her shoulders, like the lamb awaiting the blow of a butcher's axe. "So I inspire you with horror," he said at length. She made no reply. "Do I inspire you with horror?" he repeated. Her lips contracted, as though with a smile. "Yes," said she. "The headsman scoffed at the condemned. Here he has been pursuing me, threatening me, terrifying me for months. Had it not been for him, my God, How happy it should have been. It was he who cast me into this abyss. Oh heavens, it was he who killed him, my Phoebus. Here, bursting into sobs and raising her eyes to the priest. Oh, wretch, who are you? What have I done to you? Do you then hate me so? Alas, what have you against me? I love thee, cried the priest. Her tears suddenly ceased. She gazed at him with the look of an idiot. He had fallen on his knees and was devouring her with eyes of flame. Dost thou understand? I love thee, he cried again. What love? Said the unhappy girl with a shudder. He resumed. The love of a damned soul. Both remained silent for several minutes, crushed beneath the weight of their emotions. He maddened, she stupefied. Listen, said the priest at last, and a singular calm had come over him. You shall know all I am about to tell you, that which I have hitherto hardly dared to say to myself, when furtively interrogating my conscience at those deep hours of the night, when it is so dark that it seems as though God no longer saw us. Listen, before I knew you, young girl, I was happy. So was I, she said feebly. Do not interrupt me. Yes, I was happy. At least I believed myself to be so. I was pure. My soul was filled with limpid light. No head was raised more proudly and more radiantly than mine. Priests consulted me on chastity, doctors on doctrines. Yes, science was all in all to me. It was a sister to me, and a sister sufficed. Not but that with age other ideas came to me. More than once my flesh had been moved as a woman's form passed by, that force of sex and blood which, in the madness of youth, I had imagined that I had stifled forever had, more than once, convulsively raised the chain of iron vows which bind me, a miserable wretch, to the cold stones of the altar. But fasting, prayer, study, the mortifications of the cloister, rendered my soul mistress of my body once more, and then I avoided women. Moreover, I had but to open a book, and all the impure mists of my brain vanished before the splendors of science. In a few moments, I felt the gross things of earth flee far away, and I found myself once more calm, quieted, and serene, in the presence of the tranquil radiance of eternal truth. As long as the demons sent to attack me only vague shadows of women who passed occasionally before my eyes in the church, in the streets, in the fields, and who hardly recurred to my dreams, I easily vanquished them. Alas, if the victory has not remained with me, it is the fault of God, who has not created man and the demon of equal force. Listen, one day. Here the priest paused, and the prisoner heard sighs of anguish break from his breast with the sound of the death rattle. He resumed. One day, I was leaning on the window of my cell. What book was I reading then? Oh, all that is a whirlwind in my head. I was reading. The window opened upon a square. I heard a sound of tambourine and music. Annoyed at being thus disturbed in my reverie, I glanced into the square. What I beheld, others saw beside myself, and yet it was not a spectacle made for human eyes. There, in the middle of the pavement, it was midday, the sun was shining brightly, a creature was dancing. A creature so beautiful that God would have preferred her to the Virgin and have chosen her for his mother, and have wished to be born of her if she had been in existence when he was made man. Her eyes were black and splendid. In the midst of her black locks, some hairs through which the sun shone glistened like threads of gold. Her feet disappeared into their movements like the spoke of a rapidly turning wheel. Around her head, in her black tresses, there were discs of metal, which glittered in the sun, and formed a coronet of stars on her brow. Her dress, thick set with spangles, blue and dotted with 1,000 sparks, gleamed like a summer night. Her brown, supple arms twined and untwined around her waist like 2 scarves. The form of her body was surprisingly beautiful. Oh, what a resplendent figure stood out, like something luminous even in the sunlight. Alas, young girl, it was thou. Surprised, intoxicated, charmed, I allowed myself to gaze upon thee. I looked so long that I suddenly shuddered with terror. I felt that fate was seizing hold of me. The priest paused for a moment, overcome with emotion. Then he continued. Already half fascinated, I tried to cling fast to something and hold myself back from falling. I recalled the snares which Satan had already set for me. The creature before my eyes possessed that superhuman beauty which can come only from heaven or hell. It was no simple girl made with a little of our earth and dimly lighted within by the vacillating ray of a woman's soul. It was an angel, but of souls and flame and not of light. At the moment when I was meditating thus, I beheld beside you a goat, a beast of witches, which smiled as it gazed at me. The midday sun gave him golden horns. Then I perceived the snare of the demon, and I no longer doubted that you had come from hell, and that you had come thence for my perdition. I believed it. Here, the priest looked the prisoner full in the face and added, coldly, I believe it still. Nevertheless, the charm operated little by little. Your dancing whirled through my brain. I felt a mysterious spell working within me. All that should have awakened was lulled to sleep. And like those who die in the snow, I felt pleasure in allowing this sleep to draw on. All at once, you began to sing. What could I do, unhappy wretch? Your song was still more charming than your dancing. I tried to flee. Impossible. I was nailed, rooted to the spot. It seemed to me that the marble of the pavement had risen to my knees. I was forced to remain until the end. My feet were like ice. My head was on fire. At last you took pity on me. You ceased to sing. You disappeared. The reflection of the dazzling vision, the reverberation of the enchanting music disappeared by degrees from my eyes and my ears. Then I fell back into the embrasure of the window, more rigid, more feeble than a statue torn from its base. The vesper bell roused me. I drew myself up. I fled. But alas, something within me had fallen, never to rise again. Something had come upon me from which I could not flee. He made another pause and went on. Yes, dating from that day, there was within me a man whom I did not know. I tried to make use of all my remedies, the cloister, the altar, work, books, follies. Oh, how hollow does science sound when one in despair dashes against it, a head full of passions. Do you know, young girl, what I saw thenceforth between my book and me? You, your shade, the image of the luminous apparition which had one day crossed the space before me. But this image had no longer the same color. It was somber, funereal, gloomy as the black circle which long pursues the vision of the imprudent man who had gazed intently at the sun. Unable to rid myself of it, since I heard your song humming ever in my head, beheld your feet dancing always on my breviary, felt even at night, in my dreams, your form in contact with my own. I desired to see you again, to touch you, to know who you were, to see whether I should really find you like the ideal image which I had retained of you, to shatter my dream, perchance, with reality. At all events, I hoped that a new impression would efface the first, and the first had become insupportable. I sought you. I saw you once more. Calamity. When I had seen you twice, I wanted to see you 1,000 times. I wanted to see you always. Then, how stop myself on that slope of hell? Then, I no longer belonged to myself. The other end of the thread which the demon had attached to my wings, he had fastened to his foot. I became vagrant and wandering like yourself. I waited for you under porches. I stood on the lookout for you at the street corners. I watched for you from the summit of my tower. Every evening I returned to myself more charmed, more despairing, more bewitched, more lost. I had learned who you were. An Egyptian, a performer, bohemian. How could I doubt the magic? Listen. I hoped that a trial would free me from the charm. A witch enchanted Bruno dust. He had her burned and was cured. I knew it. I wanted to try the remedy. First, I tried to have you forbidden the square in front of Notre-Dame, hoping to forget you if you returned no more. You paid no heed to it. You returned. Then the idea of abducting you occurred to me. One night I made the attempt. There were 2 of us. We already had you in our power when that miserable officer came. He delivered you. Thus did he begin your unhappiness, mine, and his own. Finally, no longer knowing what to do, and what was to become of me, I denounced you to the official. I thought that I should be cured, like Bruno d'Ast. I also had a confused idea that a trial would deliver you into my hands, that, as a prisoner, I should hold you, I should have you, that there you could not escape from me, that you had already possessed me a sufficiently long time to give me the right to possess you in my turn. When one does wrong, one must do it thoroughly. 'Tis madness to halt midway in the monstrous. The extreme of crime has its delirium of joy. A priest and a witch can mingle in delight upon the truss of straw in a dungeon. Accordingly, I denounced you. It was then that I terrified you when we met. The plot which I was weaving against you, the storm which I was heaping up above your head, burst from me in threats and lightning glances. Still, I hesitated. My project had its terrible sides which made me shrink back. Perhaps I might have renounced it. Perhaps my hideous thought would have withered in my brain without bearing fruit. I thought that it would always depend upon me to follow up or continue this prosecution. But every evil thought is inexorable, and insists on becoming a deed. But where I believed myself to be all-powerful, fate was more powerful than I. Alas, 'tis fate which has seized you and delivered you to the terrible wheels of the machine which I had constructed doubly. Listen, I am nearing the end. One day, again the sun was shining brilliantly. I behold a man pass me uttering your name and laughing, who carries sensuality in his eyes. Damnation. I followed him. You know the rest. He ceased. The young girl could find but one word. Oh, my Phoebus. Not that name, said the priest, grasping her arm violently. Utter not that name. Oh, miserable wretches that you are, 'tis that name which has ruined us. Or rather, we have ruined each other by the inexplicable play of fate. You are suffering, are you not? You are cold, the night makes you blind, the dungeon envelopes you, but perhaps you still have some light in the bottom of your soul, were it only your childish love for that empty man who played with your heart, while I bear the dungeon within me. Within me there is winter, ice, despair. I have night in my soul. Do you know what I have suffered? I was present at your trial. I was seated on the official's bench. Yes, under one of the priest's cowls, there were the contortions of the damned. When you were brought in, I was there. When you were questioned, I was there. Den of wolves. It was my crime. It was my gallows that I beheld being slowly reared over your head. I was there for every witness, every proof, every plea. I could count each of your steps in the painful path. I was still there when that ferocious beast, I had not foreseen torture. Listen, I followed you to that chamber of anguish. I beheld you stripped and handled half naked by the infamous hands of the tormentor. I beheld your foot, that foot which I would have given an empire to kiss and die, that foot beneath which I have had my head crushed. I should have felt such rapture. I beheld it encased in that horrible boot which converts the limbs of a living being into one bloody clod. Oh, wretch, while I looked on at that, I held beneath my shroud a dagger, with which I lacerated my breast. When you uttered that cry, I plunged it into my flesh. At a second cry, it would have entered my heart. Look, I believe that it still bleeds. He opened his cassock. His breast was, in fact, mangled as by the claw of a tiger, and on his side he had a large and badly healed wound. The prisoner recoiled with horror. "Oh," said the priest, "young girl, have pity upon me. You think yourself unhappy. Alas, alas, you know not what unhappiness is. Oh, to love a woman, to be a priest, to be hated, to love with all the fury of one's soul, to feel that one would give for the least of her smiles one's blood, one's vitals, one's fame, one's salvation, one's immortality and eternity, this life and the other, to regret that one is not a king, emperor, archangel, god, in order that one might place a greater slave beneath her feet, to clasp her night and day in one's dreams and one's thoughts, and to behold her in love with the trappings of a soldier, and to have nothing to offer her but a priest's dirty cassock, which will inspire her with fear and disgust, to be present with one's jealousy and one's rage, while she lavishes on a miserable, blustering imbecile treasures of love and beauty, to behold that body whose form burns you, that bosom which possesses so much sweetness, that flesh palpitate and blush beneath the kisses of another. O heaven, to love your foot, her arm, her shoulder, to think of her blue veins, of her brown skin, until one writhes for whole nights together on the pavement of one's cell, and to behold all those caresses which one has dreamed of end in torture. To have succeeded only in stretching her upon the leather bed. Oh, these are veritable pincers, reddened in the fires of hell. Oh, blessed is he who is sawn between two planks, or torn in pieces by 4 horses. Do you know what that torture is, which is imposed upon you for long nights by your burning arteries, your burning heart, your breaking head, your teeth-gnawed hands, mad tormentors which turn you incessantly, as upon a red-hot gridiron, to a thought of love, of jealousy, and of despair? Young girl, mercy, a truce for a moment, a few ashes of these live coals. Wipe away, I beseech you, the perspiration which trickles in great drops from my brow. Child, torture me with one hand, but caress me with the other. Have pity, young girl, have pity upon me." The priest writhed on the wet pavement, beating his head against the corners of the stone steps. The young girl gazed at him and listened to him. When he ceased, exhausted and panting, she repeated in a low voice, "Oh, my Phoebus." The priest dragged himself towards her on his knees. "I beseech you," he cried, "if you have any heart, do not repulse me. Oh, I love you. I am a wretch. When you utter that name, unhappy girl, it is as though you crushed all the fibers of my heart beneath your teeth. Mercy! If you come from hell, I will go thither with you. I have done everything to that end. The hell where you are shall be paradise. The sight of you is more charming than that of God. Oh, speak, You will have none of me? I should have thought the mountains would be shaken in their foundations on the day when a woman would repulse such a love. Oh, if only would. Oh, how happy might we be! We would flee. I would help you to flee. We would go somewhere. We would seek that spot on earth where the sun is brightest, the sky the bluest, where the trees are most luxuriant. We would love each other. We would pour our two souls into each other, and we would have a thirst for ourselves which we would quench in common and incessantly at that fountain of inexhaustible love. She interrupted with a terrible and thrilling laugh. Look, father, you have blood on your fingers. The priest remained for several moments as though petrified, with his eyes fixed upon his hand. Well, yes, he resumed at last with strange gentleness. Insult me, scoff at me, overwhelm me with scorn, but come, come, let us make haste. It is to be tomorrow, I tell you. The gibbet on the Greve. You know it? It stands always ready. It is horrible to see you ride to that tumbrel. Oh, mercy! Until now I have never felt the power of my love for you. Follow me. We shall take your time to love me after I have saved you. You shall hate me as long as you will, but come, tomorrow, the gallows, your execution. Oh, save yourself. Spare me. He seized her arm. He was beside himself. He tried to drag her away. She fixed her eye intently on him. What has become of my Phoebus? Oh, said the priest, releasing her arm, you are pitiless. What has become of Phoebus? She repeated coldly. He is dead, cried the priest. Dead, said she, still icy and motionless. Then why do you talk to me of living? He was not listening to her. Oh, yes, said he, as though speaking to himself. He certainly must be dead. The blade pierced deeply. I believe I touched his heart with the point. Oh, my very soul was at the end of the dagger. The young girl flung herself upon him like a raging tigress and pushed him upon the steps of the staircase with supernatural force. Begone, monster, begone, assassin, leave me to die. May the blood of both of us make an eternal stain upon your brow. Be thine, priest, never, never, nothing shall unite us, not hell itself. Go, accursed man, never. The priest had stumbled on the stairs. He silently disentangled his feet from the folds of his robe, picked up his lantern again, and slowly began to ascend of the stairs which led to the door. He opened the door and passed through it. All at once, the young girl beheld his head reappear. It wore a frightful expression, and he cried, hoarse with rage and despair, I tell you, he is dead. She fell face downwards upon the floor, and there was no longer any sound audible in the cell than the sob of the drop of water which made the pool palpitate amid the darkness. End of chapter 4. Ooh, ooh, oh Nelly. Okay, so Esmeralda. Well, first of all, we get some architecture talk, and Esmeralda is in this prison, and she is being held there. She does not know how long, and all she can really hear is the drip of water from the the cell onto the floor, and it's making a puddle, and she's trying to measure time from that drip because it is so dark in this prison. She has no idea how long she's been there or what like time of day it is, and the only like human interaction, if you can call it that, that she's having is when a trapdoor is open and they give her like black bread. I'm guessing it's just really moldy and gross, and water. And then one day, who should appear but good old Claude Frollo. And he comes down there and tells her that, well, they have a little conversation. You can't just jump right in with what's going on. But tells her that she is to be killed tomorrow. And she is just like, why can't it be today? Why does it have to be tomorrow? Tomorrow is so, so long from now. And she is just like in a daze this whole time and is just like really wanting this to all be over. And so he is talking to her and is just like, listen to me and don't you interrupt me. And he goes through this long tale of like the first time that he met her and the second time that he met her, and how he has just had this uncontrollable love for her, and nothing has made him able to forget her. Like, he dreams about her. He, instead of being able to focus on the sciences of his books, he has her image just floating through his head all the time. Her shadow, just always around. He has been like entranced by her dancing and by her singing, and it is just torture to him because he loves her so, so much. All of these years, he's been able to just avoid women and avoid being tempted at all. And it has ended with her, and he wants it to stop. And we get into the territory of, if I can't have you, nobody can have you. And so he tells the tale from his perspective, from his side of following, of first trying to kidnap her with Quasimodo, and that being disrupted by Phoebus, and then of following Phoebus uh, to their meeting place being Esmeralda and Phoebus's meeting place for the night. And he was just, enraged, and he just stabbed her and knew that to get rid of this curse, she needed to die or to be tried, like on trial, just like how it was in this one other story. And so he frames her thinking like, now I shall be free of this curse. Now I shall be free of thinking of her forever. And he's there for the trial. He's there for all of the witnesses. He's there for all of the pleas. He's there in the room of her torture. And as she's being tortured, he's stabbing himself so that he feels the same thing, because she's being tried and condemned for the crime that he did. And lo and behold, it hasn't worked. He's still constantly thinking about her. And he was never predicting her to be tortured. But that goat. And so he's like, run away with me, and we will eventually be happy. I don't care that you hate me right now. I know eventually you will love me. And she asks, what has happened to Phoebus? And he's like, what are you talking about? He's dead. And she's like, well, then what's the point of living? Like, if he is dead, how dare you talk to me about living? And that enrages him. And she just keeps asking, like, what has happened to him? And he just is shouting at her that he is dead and to move on and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, I'm not going to go with you, you stupid priest. Not gonna happen. And so he leaves all in a huff, still shouting at her that he's dead. And that's where we ended the chapter. A little bleak. Ever so bleak. That dang goat. Ugh, I love that little goat. I hate that the goat is taking the brunt of the of the blame for this. If the goat wasn't there, then she would have been tried and set free, obviously, but that dang goat had to be so smart and clever and know tricks and be a performer. All right. Chapter 5. The Mother. I do not believe that there is anything sweeter in the world than the ideas which awake in a mother's heart at the sight of her child's tiny shoe, especially if it is a shoe for festivals, for Sunday, for baptism, the shoe embroidered to the very soul, a shoe in which the infant has not yet taken a step. That shoe has so much grace and daintiness. It is so impossible for it to walk that it seems to the mother as though she saw her child. She smiles upon it. She kisses it. She talks to it. She asks herself whether there can actually be a foot so tiny, and if the child be absent, the pretty shoe suffices to place the sweet and fragile creature before her eyes. She thinks she sees it. She does see it, complete, living, joyous, with its delicate hands, its round head, its pure lips, its serene eyes whose white is blue. If it is in winter, it is yonder, crawling on the carpet. It is laboriously climbing upon the ottoman, and the mother trembles lest it should approach the fire. If it is summertime, it crawls about the yard and the garden, plucks up the grass between the paving stones, gazes innocently at the big dogs, the big horses, without fear, plays with the shells, with the flowers, and makes the gardener grumble because he finds sand in the flower beds and the earth in the paths. Everything laughs and shines and plays around it, like it, even the breath of air and the ray of sun, which vie with each other in disporting among the silky ringlets of its hair. The shoe shows all this to the mother, and makes her heart melt as fire melts wax. But when the child is lost, these thousand images of joy, of charms, of tenderness which throng around the little shoe, become so many horrible things. The pretty embroidered shoe is no longer anything but an instrument of torture which eternally crushes the heart of the mother. It is always the same fiber which vibrates, the tenderest and most sensitive, but instead of an angel caressing it, it is a demon who is wrenching at it. One May morning, when the sun was rising on one of those dark blue skies against which Garofalo loves to place his descents from the cross, the recluse of Tour Roland heard a sound of wheels, of horses and irons in the Place de Grève. She was somewhat aroused by it, nodded her hair up upon her ears in order to deafen herself, and resumed her contemplation, on her knees, of the inanimate object which she had adored for 15 years. This little shoe was the universe to her, as we have already said. Her thought was shut up in it, and was destined never more to quit it except at death. The sombre cave of the Tour Roland alone knew how many bitter imprecations, touching complaints, prayers, and sobs she had wafted to heaven in connection with that charming bauble of rose-colored satin. Never was more despair bestowed upon a prettier and more graceful thing. It seemed as though her grief were breaking forth more violently than usual, and she could be heard outside lamenting in a loud and monotonous voice which rent the heart. "Oh, my daughter," she said, "my daughter, my poor, dear little child, so I shall never see thee. It is over. It always seems to me that it happened yesterday. My God, it would have been better not to give her to me than to take her away so soon. Did you not know that our children are part of ourselves, and that a mother who has lost her child no longer believes in God? Wretch that I am to have gone out that day, Lord, to have taken her from me thus. You could never have looked at me with her, when I was joyously warming her at my fire, when she laughed, she suckled, when I made her tiny feet creep up to my lips. Oh, if you had looked at that, My God, you would have taken pity on my joy. You would have taken from me the only love which lingered in my heart. Was I then, Lord, so miserable a creature that you could not look at me before condemning me? Alas, here is the shoe. Where is the foot? Where is the rest? Where is my child, my daughter? What did they do to thee? Lord, give her back to me. My knees have been worn for 15 years in praying to thee, my God. Is not that enough? Give her back to me one day, 1 hour, 1 minute, 1 minute, my Lord, and then cast me to the demon for all eternity. Oh, if I only knew where the skirt of your garment trails, I would cling to it with both hands, and you would be obliged to give me back my child. Have you no pity on her pretty little shoe? Could you condemn a poor mother to this torture for 15 years? Good Virgin of heaven, my infant Jesus has been taken from me, has been stolen from me. They devoured me on a heath. They drank her blood. They cracked her bones. Good Virgin, have pity upon me. My daughter. I want my daughter. What is it to me that she is in paradise? I do not want your angel. I want my child. I am a lioness. I want my whelp. Oh, I will writhe on the earth. I will break the stones with my forehead, and I will damn myself, and I will curse you, Lord, if you keep my child from me. You see plainly that my arms are all bitten, Lord. Has the good God no mercy? Oh, give me only salt and black bread. Only let me have my daughter to warm me like the sun. Alas, Lord my God, alas, Lord my God, I am only a vile sinner, but my daughter made me pious. I was full of religion for the love of her, and I beheld you through her smile as through an opening into heaven. Oh, if I could only once, just once more, a single time put this shoe on her pretty little pink foot, I would die blessing you, good Virgin. 15 years! She will be grown up now. Unhappy child. What? It is really true that I shall never see her more, not even in heaven, for I shall not go there myself. Oh, what misery to think that here is her shoe, and that is all. The unhappy woman flung herself upon that shoe, her consolation and her despair for so many years, and her vitals were rent with sobs as on the first day, because, for a mother who has lost her child, it is always the first day. That grief never grows old. The mourning garments may grow white and threadbare. The heart remains dark. At that moment, the fresh and joyous cries of children passed in front of the cell. Every time that children crossed her vision or struck her ear, the poor mother flung herself into the darkest corner of her sepulchre, and one would have said that she sought to plunge her head into the stone in order not to hear them. This time, on the contrary, she drew herself upright with a start and listened eagerly. One of the little boys had just said, "They are going to hang that girl today." With the abrupt leap of that spider which we have seen fling itself upon a fly at the trembling of its web, she rushed to her air hole, which opened, as the reader knows, on the Place de Grève. A ladder had, in fact, been raised up against the permanent gibbet, and the hangman's assistant was busying himself with adjusting the chains which had been rusted by the rain. There were some people standing about. The laughing group of children was already far away. The sacked nun sought with her eyes some passer-by whom she might question. All at once, beside her cell, she perceived a priest making a pretext of reading the public breviary, but who was much less occupied with the lectern of latticed iron than with the gallows, toward which he cast a fierce and gloomy glance from time to time. She recognized Monsieur the Archdeacon of Josas, a holy man. "Father," she inquired, "whom are they going to hang yonder?" The priest looked at her and made no reply. She repeated her question. Then he said, "I know not." "Some children said that it was a young performer," went on the recluse. "I believe so," said the priest. Then Paquette La Chantefleurie burst into hyena-like laughter. "Sister," said the archdeacon, "do you not hate the young performers heartily?" "Do I hate them?" she exclaimed the recluse. "They are vampires, stealers of children. They devoured my daughter, my child, my only child. I have no longer any heart. They devoured it." She was frightful. The priest looked at her coldly. "There is one in particular whom I hate, and whom I have cursed," she resumed. "It is a young one, of the age which my daughter would be if her mother had not eaten my daughter. Every time that young viper passes in front of my cell, she sets my blood in a ferment." "Well, sister, rejoice," said the priest, icy as a sepulchral statue. "That is the one whom you are about to see die." His head fell upon his bosom, and he moved slowly away. The recluse writhed her arms with joy. "I predicted it for her, that she would ascend thither. Thanks, priest," she cried. And she began to pace up and down with long strides before the grating of her window, her hair disheveled, her eyes flashing, with her shoulder striking against the wall, with the wild air of a female wolf in a cage, who has long been famished, and who feels the hour for her repast drawing near. End of chapter 5. Okay, chapter 5. We've gone back to the recluse, who is, we know from before, the mother who has lost her child from these traveling performers, and so she hates all of them. Specifically, all of her hatred is toward La Esmeralda because she is about the age of which her daughter should be, had she not been taken and, eaten by these performers. And so she is just praying to God, and she's been praying to God for 15 years that some sort of justice be had, and that she can actually see her daughter, and not a ghost because, not a ghost, not an angel, not as an angel, because she knows that she is a sinner and she will not be going to heaven like her daughter surely has, but she would be going to hell. And so she is just going back and forth, and then she hears these children walking past, and usually she hides in the corner because she doesn't want to be reminded of the child that she no longer has, even though she is holding dearly onto this tiny, tiny little shoe. That's all she has left of her daughter. And she hears one of the children saying that there's going to be a hanging today. And so she's like, well, who's going to be hanged? And she sees the priest, and she asks the priest, and the priest is like, oh, it's going to be, one of these bohemian performers. And she's like, which one? And the priest is like, doesn't answer her. And she's like, oh, I really, really need it to be this one specific performer because she is the age of my daughter. And my daughter would still be around if this performer's mother hasn't taken her away from me. And the priest is like, well, happy day to you, because it is going to be her. And then she just laughs hysterically and is like, finally, finally, justice. But we as readers, I'm sure, have already put together the same thing that I'm thinking, in that La Esmeralda is actually her child. That is what I'm thinking. And I'm absolutely seeing the irony in this. Because Esmeralda does not know who her parents are at all. She doesn't know who they are. She just knows that she will find them one day, and she holds on to that. And the recluse, her daughter, we don't actually have proof that she is dead. And so she is of this age, and La Esmeralda has been described as being the most beautiful woman. And the recluse's daughter, when she was a wee little babe, was the most beautiful child. So I'm putting two and two together, and I'm pretty sure I'm getting four. But that's what I think is happening, and it is just the irony of is actually her daughter. And so she is going to joyously watch her daughter die, which is terrible. Everything is terrible. To sum up, everything is terrible. All right. Chapter 6. It is a long one. Let's go. Chapter 6. Three human hearts differently constructed. Phoebus was not dead, however. Men of that stamp die hard. When Master Philippe Lullier, advocate extraordinary of the king, had said to poor Esmeralda, "He is dying," it was an error or a jest. When the archdeacon had repeated to the condemned girl, "He is dead," the fact is that he knew nothing about it, but that he believed it, that he counted on it, that he did not doubt it, that he devoutly hoped it. It would have been too hard for him to give favorable news of his rival to the woman whom he loved. Any man would have done the same in his place. It was not that Phoebus's wound had not been serious, but it had not been as much so as the archdeacon believed. The physician, to whom the soldiers of the watch had carried him at the first moment, had feared for his life during the space of a week, and had even told him so in Latin. But youth had gained the upper hand, and, as frequently happens, in spite of prognostications and diagnoses, nature had amused himself by saving the sick man under the physician's very nose. It was while he was still lying on the leech's pallet that he had submitted to the interrogations of Philippe Lelier and the official inquisitors, which had annoyed him greatly. Hence, one fine morning, feeling himself better, he had left his golden spurs with the leech as payment, and had slipped away. This had not, however, interfered with the progress of the affair. Justice at that epoch troubled itself very little about the clearness and definiteness of a criminal suit. Provided that the accused was hung, that was all that was necessary. Now the judge had plenty of proofs against La Esmeralda. They had supposed Phoebus to be dead, and that was the end of the matter. Phoebus, on his side, had not fled far. He had simply rejoined his company in garrison at Heux-en-Brie, in the Isle de France, a few stages from Paris. After all, it did not please him in the least to appear in this suit. He had a vague feeling that he should play a ridiculous figure in it. On the whole, he did not know what to think of the whole affair. Superstitious, and not given to devoutness, like every soldier who is only a soldier, when he came to question himself about this adventure, he did not feel assured as to the goat, as to the singular fashion in which he had met La Esmeralda, as to the no less strange manner in which she had allowed him to divine her love, as to her character as a performer, and lastly, as to the surly monk. He perceived in all these incidents much more magic than love, probably a sorceress, perhaps the devil, a comedy in short, or, to speak in the language of that day, a very disagreeable mystery, in which he played a very awkward part, the role of blows and derision. The captain was quite put out of countenance about it. He experienced that sort of shame which our La Fontaine has so admirably defined, ashamed as a fox who has been caught by a fowl. Moreover, he hoped that the affair would not get noised abroad, that his name would hardly be pronounced in it, and that in any case it would not go beyond the courts of the Tournelle. In this he was not mistaken. There was then no Gazette de Tribunal, and as not a week passed which had not its counterfeit to boil, or its witch to hang, or its heretic to burn, at some one of the innumerable justices of Paris. People were so accustomed to seeing in all the squares the ancient feudal Themis, bare-armed, with sleeves stripped up, performing her duty at the gibbets, the ladders, and the pillories, that they hardly paid any heed to it. Fashionable society of that day hardly knew the name of the victim who passed by at the corner of the street, and it was the populace at the most who regaled themselves with this coarse fare. An execution was an habitual incident of public highways, like the brazen pane of the baker or the slaughterhouse of the knacker. The executioner was only a sort of butcher of a little deeper dye than the rest. Hence Phoebus's mind was soon at ease on the score of the enchantress Esmeralda, or similar, as he called her, concerning the blow from the dagger of the Bohemian or of the surly monk. It mattered little which to him, and as to the issue of the trial. But as soon as his heart was vacant of that direction, fleur-de-lis returned to it. Captain Phoebus's heart, like the physics of that day, abhorred a vacuum. Quasimodo was a very insipid place to stay at then, a village of farriers and cowgirls with chapped hands, a long line of poor dwellings and thatched cottages which borders the grand road on both sides for half a league, a tale, Q, in short, as its name imports. Fleur-de-lis was his last passion but one, a pretty girl, a charming dowry. Accordingly, one fine morning, quite cured, and assuming that, after the lapse of 2 months, the Bohemian affair must be completely finished and forgotten, the amorous cavalier arrived on a prancing horse at the door of the mansion. He paid no attention to a tolerably numerous rabble which had assembled in the Place du Parvis before the portal of Notre-Dame. He remembered that it was the month of May. He supposed that it was some procession, some Pentecost, some festival, hitched his horse to the ring at the door, and happily ascended the stairs to his beautiful betrothed. He was alone with her mother. The scene of the witch, her goat, her cursed alphabet, and Phoebus's long absence still weighed on Fleur-de-lis's heart. Nevertheless, when she beheld her captain enter, she thought him so handsome, his new doublet so new, his baldric so shining, and his air so impassioned, that she blushed with pleasure. The noble damsel herself was more charming than ever. Her magnificent blonde hair was plaited in a ravishing manner. She was dressed entirely in that sky blue which becomes fair people so well, a bit of coquetry which she had learned from Colomb, and her eyes were swimming in that languor of love which becomes them still better. Phoebus, who had seen nothing in the line of beauty since he left the village maids of Quasimodo, was intoxicated with Fleur-de-lis, which imparted to our officer so eager and gallant an air that his peace was immediately made. Madame de Gondelaurier herself, still maternally seated in her big armchair, had not the heart to scold him. As for Fleur-de-lis's reproaches, they expired in tender cooings. The young girl was seated near the window, still embroidering her grotto of Neptune. The captain was leaning over the back of her chair, and she was addressing her her caressing reproaches to him in a low voice. "What has become of you these 2 long months, wicked man?" "Well, I swear to you," replied Phoebus, somewhat embarrassed by the question, "that you are beautiful enough to set an archbishop to dreaming." She could not repress a smile. "Good, good sir, let my beauty alone and answer my question. A fine beauty, in sooth." "Well, my dear cousin, I was recalled to the garrison." "And where is that, if you please? And why did you not come to say farewell?" "At Quambry." Phoebus was delighted with the first question, which helped him to avoid the second. "And that is quite close by, monsieur. Why did you not come to see me a single time?" Here Phoebus was rather seriously embarrassed. "Because the service, and then, charming cousin, I have been ill." "Ill?" she repeated in alarm. "Yes, wounded." "Wounded?" The poor child was completely upset. "Oh, do not be frightened at that," said Phoebus carelessly. "It was nothing. A quarrel, a sword cut. What is that to you?" "What is that to me?" exclaimed Fleur-de-Lis, raising her beautiful eyes filled with tears. "Oh, you do not say what you think when you speak thus. What sword cut was that? I wish to know it all." "Well, my dear fair one, I had a falling out with Mehifedi, you know, the lieutenant in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and we ripped open a few inches of skin of each other. That is all." The mendacious captain was perfectly well aware that an affair of honor always makes a man stand well in the eyes of a woman. In fact, Fleur-de-Lis looked him full in the face, all agitated with fear, pleasure, and admiration. Still, she was not completely reassured. "Provided that you are wholly cured, my Phoebus," said she, "I do not know your Mehifedi, but he is a villainous man. And whence arose this quarrel?" Here Phoebus, whose imagination was endowed with but mediocre power of creation, began to find himself in a quandary as to a means of extricating himself for his prowess. "Oh, how do I know? A mere nothing, a horse, a remark, fair cousin," he exclaimed, for the sake of changing the conversation. "What noise is this in the cathedral square?" He approached the window. "Oh, mon Dieu, fair cousin, how many people there are on the place!" "Oh, I know not," said Fleur-de-Lis. "It appears that a witch is to do penance this morning before the church, and thereafter to be hung." The captain was so thoroughly persuaded that La Esmeralda's affair was concluded that he was but little disturbed by Fleur-de-Lis's words. Still, he asked her 1 or 2 questions. "What is the name of this witch?" "Why, I do not know," she replied. "And what is she said to have done?" She shrugged her white shoulders. "I know not." "Oh, mon Dieu," said her mother, "there are many witches nowadays, and I dare say they burn them without knowing their names. One might as well seek the name of every cloud in the sky. After all, one may be tranquil. The good God keeps his register." Here the venerable dame rose and came to the window. "Good Lord, you are right, Phoebus," she said. "The rabble is indeed great. There are people on all the roofs, blessed be God. Do you know, Phoebus, this reminds me of my best days, the entrance of King Charles VII, when, also, there were many people. I no longer remember in what year it was. When I speak of this to you, it produces upon you the effect, does it not? The effect of something very old, and upon me of something very young. Oh, the crowd was far finer than at the present day. They even stood upon the machicolations of the poor Saint Antoine. The king had the queen on a pillion, and after their highness came all the ladies mounted behind all the lords. I remember that they laughed loudly because beside Amignon de Garland, who was very short of stature, there rode the Sire Matefilon, a chevalier of gigantic size, who had killed heaps of English. It was very fine, a procession of all the gentlemen of France, with their eyes or oriflammes wavering red before the eye. There were some with pennons and some with banners. How can I tell? The Sire de Calonne with a pennon, Jean de Chateaumarun with a banner, the Sire de Courcy with a banner, and a more ample one than any of the others, except Duc de Bourbon. Alas, 'tis a sad thing to think that all that has existed, and exists no longer. The two lovers were not listening to the venerable dowager. Phoebus had returned and was leaning on the back of his betrothed chair, a charming post whence his libertine glance plunged into all the openings of Fleur-de-Lis's gorget. This gorget gaped so conveniently, and allowed him to see so many exquisite things, and to divine so many more, that Phoebus, dazzled by this skin with its gleams of satin, said to himself, "How can anyone love anything but a fair skin?" Both were silent. The young girl raised sweet, enraptured eyes to him from time to time, and their hair mingled in a ray of spring sunshine. "Phoebus," said Fleur-de-Lis suddenly, in a low voice, "we are to be married in 3 months hence. Swear to me that you have never loved any other woman than myself." "I swear it, fair angel," replied Phoebus, and his passionate glances aided the sincere tone of his voice in convincing Fleur-de-Lis. Meanwhile, the good mother, charmed to see the betrothed pair on terms of such perfect understanding, had just quitted the apartment to attend to some domestic matter. Phoebus observed it, and this so emboldened the adventurous captain that very strange ideas mounted to his brain. Fleur-de-Lis loved him. He was her betrothed. She was alone with him. His former taste for her had reawakened, not with all its freshness, but with all its ardor. After all, there is no great harm in tasting one's wheat while it is still in the blade. I do not know whether these ideas passed through his mind, but one thing is certain, that Fleur-de-Lis was suddenly alarmed by the expression of his glance. She looked round and saw that her mother was no longer there. "Oh, good heavens," said she, blushing and uneasy, "how very warm I am!" "I think, in fact," replied Phoebus, "that it cannot be far from midday. The sun is troublesome. We need only lower the curtains." "No, no," exclaimed the poor little thing. "On the contrary, I need air." And like a fawn who feels the breath of the pack of hounds, she rose, ran to the window, opened it, and rushed upon the balcony. Phoebus, much discomfited, followed her. The Place du Parvis Notre-Dame, upon which the balcony looked, as the reader knows, presented at that moment a singular and sinister spectacle which caused the fright of the timid Fleur-de-Lis to change its nature. An immense crowd, which overflowed into all the neighboring streets, encumbered the place. Properly speaking, the little wall, breast high, which surrounded the place, would not have sufficed to keep it free had it not been lined with a thick hedge of sergeants and hack-butiers, culverins in hand. Thanks to this thicket of pikes and arquebuses, the Parvis was empty. Its entrance was guarded by a force of halberdiers with the armorial bearings of the bishop. The large doors of the church were closed, and formed a contrast with the innumerable windows on the place, which, open to their very gables, allowed a view of thousands of heads, heaped up almost like the piles of bullets in a park of artillery. The surface of this rabble was dingy, dirty, earthy. The spectacle which it was expecting was evidently one of the sort which possesses the privilege of bringing out and calling together the vilest among the populace. Nothing is so hideous as the noise which was made by that swarm of yellow caps and dirty heads. In that throng there were more laughs than cries, more women than men. From time to time a sharp and vibrating voice pierced the general clamor. "Is she to be hung yonder?" "Fool, 'tis here that she is to make her apology in her shift. The good God is going to cough Latin in her face. That is always done here at midday. If 'tis the gallows that you wish, go to the greve." "I will go there afterwards." "Tell me, is it true that she refused a confessor?" "It appears so." "Ah, you see what a pagan she is." "'Tis the custom, monsieur. The bailiff of the court is bound to deliver the malefactor ready judged for execution, if he be a layman, to the provost of Paris, if a clerk, to the official of the bishopric." "Thank you, sir." "Oh, God," said Fleur-de-Lis, "the poor creature." This thought filled with sadness the glance which she cast upon the populace. The captain, much more occupied with her than with that pack of the rabble, was amorously rumpling her girdle behind. She turned round, entreating and smiling. "Let me alone, Phoebus. If my mother were to return, she would see your hand." At that moment, midday rang slowly out from the clock of Notre-Dame. A murmur of satisfaction broke out in the crowd. The last vibration of the 12th stroke had hardly died away when all heads surged like the waves beneath a squall, and an immense shout went up from the pavement, the windows, and the roofs. "There she is!" Fleur-de-Lis pressed her hands to her eyes, that she might not see. "Charming girl," said Phoebus. "Do you wish to withdraw?" "No," she replied, and she opened through curiosity the eyes which she had closed through fear. A tumbril drawn by a stout Norman horse, and all surrounded by cavalry in violet livery with white crosses, had just debouched upon the place through the Rue Saint-Pierre-aux-Boeufs. The sergeants of the watch were clearing a passage for it through the crowd by stout blows from their clubs. Beside the cart rode several officers of justice and police, recognizable by their black costume and their awkwardness in the saddle. Master Jacques Charlemagne paraded at their head. In the fatal cart sat a young girl with her arms tied behind her back, and with no priest beside her. She was in her shift, her long black hair. The fashion then was to cut it off only at the foot of the gallows, fell in disorder upon her half-bared throat and shoulders. Athwart that waving hair, more glossy than the plumage of a raven, a thick, rough, gray rope was visible, twisted and knotted, chafing her delicate collarbones and twining round the charming neck of the poor girl like an earthworm round a flower. Beneath that rope glittered a tiny amulet, ornamented with bits of green glass, which had been left to her, no doubt, because nothing is refused to those who are about to die. The spectators in the windows could see in the bottom of the cart her naked legs, which she strove to hide beneath her as by a final feminine instinct. At her feet lay a little goat, bound. The condemned girl held together with her teeth her imperfectly fastened shift. One would have said that she suffered still more in her misery from being thus exposed almost naked to the eye of all. Alas, modesty is not made for such shocks. "Oh, Jesus," said Fleur-de-Lis hastily to the captain. "Look, fair cousin, 'tis that wretched Bohemian girl with the goat." So saying, she turned to Phoebus. His eyes were fixed on the tumbril. He was very pale. "What Bohemian with the goat?" he stammered. "What?" resumed Fleur-de-Lis. "Do you not remember?" Phoebus interrupted her. "I do not know what you mean." He made a step to re-enter the room, but Fleur-de-Lis, whose jealousy, previously so vividly aroused by this same young girl, had just been reawakened. Fleur-de-Lis gave him a look full of penetration and distrust. She vaguely recalled at that moment having heard of a captain mixed up in the trial of that witch. "What is the matter with you?" she said to Phoebus. "One would say that this woman had disturbed you." Phoebus forced a sneer. "Me? Not in the least in the world. Yes, certainly." "Remain, then," she continued imperiously, "and let us see the end." The unlucky captain was obliged to remain. He was somewhat reassured by the fact that the condemned girl never removed her eyes from the bottom of the cart. It was but too surely La Esmeralda. In this last stage of opprobrium and misfortune, she was still beautiful. Her great black eyes appeared still larger because of the emaciation of her cheeks. Her pale profile was pure and sublime. She resembled what she had been, in the same degree that a virgin by Masaccio resembled a virgin by Raphael, weaker, thinner, more delicate. Moreover, there was nothing in her which was not shaken in some sort, and which, with the exception of her modesty, she did not let go at will, so profoundly had she been broken by stupor and despair. Her body bounded at every jolt of the tumbril like a dead or broken thing. Her gaze was dull and imbecile. A tear was still visible in her eyes, but motionless and frozen, so to speak. Meanwhile, the lugubrious cavalcade has traversed the crowd amid cries of joy and curious attitudes. But as a faithful historian, we must state that on beholding her so beautiful, so depressed, many were moved with pity, even among the hardest of them. The tumbril had entered the Parvis. It halted before the central portal. The escort ranged themselves in line on both sides. The crowd became silent, and, in the midst of this silence full of anxiety and solemnity, the two leaves of the grand door swung back as of themselves on their hinges, which gave a creak like the sound of a fife. Then there became visible in all its length the deep, gloomy church, hung in black, sparely lighted with a few candles gleaming afar off on the principal altar, opened in the midst of the place, which was dazzling with light, like the mouth of a cavern. At the very extremity, in the gloom of the apse, a gigantic silver cross was visible against a black drapery which hung from the vault to the pavement. The whole nave was deserted. But a few heads of priests could be seen moving confusedly in the distant choir stalls, and, at the moment when the great door opened, there escaped from the church a loud, solemn, and monotonous chanting, which cast over the heads of the condemned girl in gusts fragments of melancholy psalms. Non tenembo milia populi circumdandis me, exsurge Domine, salvam me fac Deus. Salvam me fac Deus, quanam intraveritam aquae esque ad animam meam. Infixus sum in limo profundi et non est substantia. At the same time, another voice, separate from the choir, intoned upon the step of the chief altar this melancholy offertory. Qui verbum meam audit et credit ea qui missit me habet vitam aeternam et in judicium non venet, sed transit a morte in vidam. There is a footnote, and it says, "He that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me hath eternal life, and hath not come into condemnation, but is passed from death to life. This chant, which a few old men buried in the gloom sang from afar over that beautiful creature, full of youth and life, caressed by the warm air of spring, inundated with sunlight, was the Mass for the dead. The people listened devoutly. The unhappy girl seemed to lose her sight and her consciousness in the obscure interior of the church. Her white lips moved as though in prayer, and the headman's assistant, who approached to assist her to alight from the cart, heard her repeating this word in a low tone: Phoebus. They untied her hands, made her alight, accompanied by her goat, which had also been unbound and which bleated with joy at finding itself free. And they made her walk barefoot on the hard pavement to the foot of the steps leading to the door. The rope about her neck trailed behind her. One would have said it was a serpent following her. Then the chanting in the church ceased. A great golden cross and a row of wax candles began to move through the gloom. The halberds of the motley beadles clanked, and, a few moments later, a long procession of priests in chasubles and deacons in dalmatics marched gravely towards the condemned girl, as they drawled their song, spread out before her view and that of the crowd. But her glance rested on the one who marched at the head immediately after the cross-bearer. "Oh," she said in a low voice and with a shudder, "'tis he again, the priest." It was, in fact, the archdeacon. On his left he had the sub-chanter, on his right, the chanter, armed with his official wand. He advanced with head thrown back, his eyes fixed and wide, intoning in a strong voice, "De ventre inferi, clamavi et exaudisti vossum meam, et projecisti me in profundum in corde maris, et flumem circumdedete me." There's a footnote. Thank you. "Out of the belly of hell cried I, and thou heardest my voice. For thou hadst cast me into the deep in the midst of the seas, and the floods compassed me about." At the moment when he made his appearance in the full daylight beneath the lofty arched portal, enveloped in an ample cope of silver barred with a black cross, he was so pale that more than one person in the crowd thought that one of the marble bishops who knelt on the sepulchral stones of the choir had risen and was come to receive upon the brink of the tomb the woman who was about to die. She, no less pale, no less like a statue, had hardly noticed that they had placed in her hand a heavy, lighted candle of yellow wax. She had not heard the yelping voice of the clerk reading the fatal contents of the apology. When they told her to respond, "Amen," she responded, "Amen." She only recovered life and force when she beheld the priest make a sign to her guards to withdraw, and himself advance alone towards her. Then she felt her blood boil in her head, and a remnant of indignation flashed up in that soul already benumbed and cold. The archdeacon approached her slowly. Even in that extremity, she beheld him cast an eye sparkling with sensuality, jealousy, and desire over her exposed form. Then he said aloud, "Young girl, have you asked God's pardon for your faults and shortcomings?" He bent down to her ear and added, the spectator supposed that he was receiving her last confession, "Will you have me? I can still save you." She looked intently at him. "Begone, demon, or I will denounce you." He gave vent to a horrible smile. "You will not be believed. You will only add a scandal to a crime. Reply quickly. Will you have me? What have you done with my Phoebus? He is dead, said the priest. At that moment, the wretched archdeacon raised his head mechanically and beheld at the other end of the place, in the balcony of the gondolier mansion, the captain standing beside Fleur-de-Lis. He staggered, passed his hand across his eyes, looked again, muttered a curse, and all his features were violently contorted. Well, die then, he hissed between his teeth. No one shall have you. Then, raising his hand over the young girl, he exclaimed in a funereal voice, I nunc anima ansep et sit tibi Deus misericors. There's a footnote translation. Go now, soul, trembling in the balance, and God have mercy upon thee. This was the dread formula with which it was the custom to conclude these gloomy ceremonies. It was the signal agreed upon between the priest and the executioner. The crowd knelt. Kyrie eleison. Footnote. Lord, have mercy upon us, said the priests, who had remained beneath the arch of the portal. Kyrie eleison, repeated the throng in that murmur which runs over all heads like the waves of a troubled sea. Amen, said the archdeacon. He turned his back on the condemned girl. His head sank upon his breast once more. He crossed his hands and rejoined his escort of priests, and a moment later he was seen to disappear with the cross, the candles, and the copse beneath the misty arches of the cathedral, and his sonorous voice was extinguished by degrees in the choir as he chanted this verse of despair. Omnis gurgits tui et fluctus tui super me transierunt. There's a footnote. All thy waves and thy billows have gone over me. At the same time, the intermittent clash of the iron butts of the beetles' halberds, gradually dying away among the columns of the nave, produced the effect of a clock hammer striking the last hour of the condemned. The doors of Notre-Dame remained open, allowing a view of the empty, desolate church draped in mourning, without candles, and without voices. The condemned girl remained motionless in her place, waiting to be disposed of. One of the sergeants of police was obliged to notify Master Chameleux of the fact, as the latter, during his entire scene, had been engaged in studying the bas-relief of the grand portal which represents, according to some, the sacrifice of Abraham, according to others, the philosopher's alchemical operation, the sun being figured forth by the angel, the fire by the torch, the artisan by Abraham. There was considerable difficulty in drawing him away from that contemplation, but at length he turned round, and at a signal which he gave, 2 men clad in yellow, the executioner's assistants, approached the young girl to bind her hands once more. The unhappy creature, at the moment of mounting once again the fatal cart and proceeding to her last halting place, was seized, possibly with some poignant clinging to life. She raised her dry, red eyes to heaven, to the sun, to the silvery clouds, cut here and there by a blue trapezium or triangle. Then she lowered them to objects around her, to the earth, the throng, the houses. All at once, while the yellow man was binding her elbows, she uttered a terrible cry, a cry of joy. Yonder, on that balcony, At the corner of the place, she had just caught sight of him, of her friend, her lord, Phoebus, the other apparition of her life. The judge had lied. The priest had lied. It was certainly he. He could not doubt it. She could not doubt it. He was there, handsome, alive, dressed in his brilliant uniform, his plume on his head, his sword by his side. "Phoebus!" she cried. "My Phoebus!" And she tried to stretch towards him, arms trembling with love and rapture, but they were bound. Then she saw the captain frown. A beautiful young girl who was leaning against him gazed at him with disdainful lips and irritated eyes. Then Phoebus uttered some words which did not reach her, and both disappeared precipitately behind the window opening upon the balcony, which closed after them. "Phoebus!" she cried wildly. "Can it be you? Believe it? Can it be you? Believe it?" A monstrous thought had just presented itself to her. She remembered that she had been condemned to death for murder committed on the person of Phoebus. She had borne up until that moment, but this last blow was too harsh. She fell lifeless on the pavement. "Come," said Charmolue. "Carry her to the cart and make an end of it." No one had yet observed in the gallery of the statues of the kings, carved directly above the arches of the portal, a strange spectator who had, up to that time, observed everything with such impassiveness, with a neck so strange, a visage so hideous that, in his motley accoutrement of red and violet, he might have been taken for one of those stone monsters through whose mouths the long gutters of the cathedral have discharged their waters for 600 years. This spectator had missed nothing that had taken place since midday in front of the portal of Notre-Dame, and at the very beginning he had securely fastened to one of the small columns a large knotted rope, one end of which trailed on the flight of steps below. This being done, he began to look on tranquilly, whistling from time to time when a blackbird flitted past. Suddenly, at the moment when the superintendent's assistants were preparing to execute Charmoleu's phlegmatic order, he threw his legs over the balustrade of the gallery, seized the rope with his feet, his knees, and his hands. Then he was seen to glide down the facade, as a drop of rain slips down a window pane, rush to the two executioners with the swiftness of a cat which has fallen from a roof, knock them down with two enormous fists, pick up the young girl with one hand, as a child would her doll, and dash back into the church with a single bound, lifting the young girl above his head, and crying in a formidable voice, "Sanctuary!" This was done with such rapidity that had it taken place at night, the whole of it could have been seen in the space of a single flash of lightning. "Sanctuary! Sanctuary!" repeated the crowd, and the clapping of 10,000 hands made Quasimodo's single eye sparkle with joy and pride. This shock restored the condemned girl to her senses. She raised her eyelids, looked at Quasimodo, then closed them again suddenly, as though terrified by her deliverer. Charmolue was stupefied, as well as the executioners and the entire escort. In fact, within the bounds of Notre-Dame, the condemned girl could not be touched. The cathedral was a place of refuge. All temporal jurisdiction expired upon its threshold. Quasimodo had halted beneath the great portal. His huge feet seemed as solid on the pavement of the church as the heavy Roman pillars. His great, bushy head sat low between his shoulders, like the heads of lions, who also have a mane and no neck. He held the young girl, who was quivering all over, suspended from his horny hands like a white drapery. But he carried her with as much care as though he feared to break her or blight her. One would have said that he felt that she was a delicate, exquisite, precious thing made for other hands than his. There were moments when he looked as if not daring to touch her, even with his breath. Then, all at once, he would press her forcibly in his arms, against his angular bosom, like his own possession, his treasure, as the mother of that child would have done. His gnome's eye fastened upon her, inundated her with tenderness, sadness, and pity, and was suddenly raised, filled with lightnings. Then the woman laughed and wept. The crowd stamped with enthusiasm, for at that moment Quasimodo had a beauty of his own. He was handsome. He, that orphan, that foundling, that outcast, he felt himself august and strong. He gazed in the face of that society from which he was banished, and in which he had so powerfully intervened, of that human justice from which he had wrenched its prey, of all those tigers whose jaws were forced to remain empty, of those policemen, those judges, those executioners, of all that force of the king which he, the meanest of creatures, had just broken with the force of God. And then it was touching to behold this protection which had fallen from a being so hideous upon a being so unhappy, a creature condemned to death, saved by Quasimodo. They were two extremes of natural and social wretchedness coming into contact and aiding each other. Meanwhile, after several moments of triumph, Quasimodo had plunged abruptly into the church with his burden. The populace, fond of all prowess, sought him with their eyes beneath the gloomy nave, regretting that he had so speedily disappeared from their acclamations. All at once, he was seen to reappear at one of the extremities of the gallery of the kings of France. He traversed it, running like a madman, raising his conquest high in his arms and shouting, "Sanctuary!" The crowd broke forth into fresh applause. The gallery passed. He plunged once more into the interior of the church. A moment later, he reappeared upon the upper platform with the young girl still in his arms, still running madly, still crying, "Sanctuary," and the throng applauded. Finally, he made his appearance for the third time upon the summit of the tower where hung the great bell. From that point he seemed to be showing to the entire city the girl whom he had saved, and his voice of thunder, that voice which was so rarely heard, and which he never heard himself, repeated thrice with frenzy, even to the clouds, "Sanctuary! Sanctuary! Sanctuary!" "Noel!" shouted the populace in its turn, and that immense acclamation flew to astonish the crowd assembled at the Grave on the other bank, and the recluse who was still waiting for her eyes, with her eyes riveted on the gibbet. End of the chapter, and end of book 8. Okay, this chapter, a lot has happened. Okay, so we know that Phoebus is alive. We know that. We saw him. We were with him. And he was rejoined with his cousin, who is also his betrothed, Fleur-de-Lis. And he, because of his escape with death and all of this, he now has like a new passion for Fleur-de-Lis, which he didn't have before. And, they're talking about blah, blah, blah. And there's noise outside, and they are drawn to the noise, and they're like, "Oh, well, what's going on?" It's like, "Oh, there's going to be a hanging, some bohemian performer." And they're like, "Oh, okay, well, do you know who?" And it's like, "I don't know. Who knows?" You never know with performers. They're all devilments. And so then they see who it is that is to be apologizing. And Fleur-de-Lis recognizes her and is like, "Wait a minute, isn't that La Esmeralda?" And Phoebus is like, "Excuse me, what?" And he goes to the window and he's like, no, that can't possibly be her. But it's definitely her, and he knows that it's her. And so they're watching all of this, and then we go to Esmeralda, and she is still in her shock and daze. And also, she's been in a dark, dank little cellar prison, not knowing, how long she's been there, if it's day, if it's night, nothing like that. It has been several months. It has been 2 months since the criminal act of which she is being charged for. And so she's there and she's like, all right, say your apology. And so she's just, repeating what they're saying and, saying amen at the end because that's what she's supposed to say. And she's just not really here because she knows that Phoebus is dead. And she is still thinking about him and, still having his name on her lips and everything like that. And she is getting ready to be, executed and moved over to the execution area. And the priest Claude like leans over and is like, "Hey, can still get you out of here. Just say the word. Just say you love me and we can go." And she's like, "Heck no. A curse on your houses." And he's like, "All right, fine." And gives the nod and like the traditional, not salutation, but the traditional like line for ending and the like waiver for the executioner to like proceed on. And then Esmeralda like looks up. Well, the first person to notice is Claude. He notices Phoebus and he's like, "Holy heckadoodles, he's actually alive." Because he truly did believe and want Phoebus to be dead. And Esmeralda looks up and she's like, "Holy heckadoodles, he's alive. Oh my god, this is wonderful. He's alive. And like, I can continue living. Oh, wait a minute. They're gonna kill me because they think that I killed him and am a witch." And so she like comes to this realization and they're like about to like put her on the cart and like take her away to the place where she's going to be executed. And then Quasimodo swings in like Tarzan. And I love it. He's just like on this rope. He swings down, he grabs her, and then swings back up to the note to the church and is like, "Sanctuary." And then the crowd is like, "Oh, yeah, sanctuary. She's in the church. They can't do anything to her because she's seeking refuge." And the crowd is like going wild. They love it. The crowd is wild. They just want to show. I think they really don't care if she's innocent or guilty because they loved her when she was a performer and then they were like, "You are a witch and you must die," when they saw her on trial. And now that she is being like saved, they're like, "Yeah, sanctuary." And so people who are over at the like execution site are still just patiently waiting. They don't know that any of this has happened, and particularly the person waiting for the execution is our recluse who thinks that, all of the bad things that have happened to her daughter are because of this young girl, like placing all of that blame on her, when really what I think is that she is the daughter that was stolen. And that's where we are. That's where we've ended. We have time for one more chapter. I'm excited. Like a water dance. Okay, let's do it. One more chapter. Here we go. One more chapter. Chapter 1. Well, book ninth, chapter 1. Delirium. Claude Frollo was no longer in Notre-Dame when his adopted son so abruptly cut the fatal web in which the archdeacon and the young girl were entangled. On returning to the sacristy, he had torn off his alb, cope, and stole, and flung all into the hands of the stupefied beadle. Had made his escape through the private door of the cloister, and ordered a boatman of the Touraine to transport him to the left bank of the river. and had plunged into the hilly streets of the university, not knowing whither he was going, encountering at every step groups of men and women who were hurrying joyously towards the Pont Saint-Michel, in the hope of still arriving in time to see the witch hung there, pale, wild, more troubled, more blind, and more fierce than a night bird let loose and pursued by a troop of children in broad daylight. He no longer knew where he was, what he thought, or whether he was dreaming. He was forward. He went forward, walking, running, taking any street at haphazard, making no choice, only urged ever onward away from the Grève, the horrible Grève, which he felt confusedly to be behind him. In this manner he skirted Mont Sainte-Geneviève and finally emerged from the town of Port Saint-Victor. He continued his flight as long as he could see, when he turned round, the turreted enclosure of the university, and the rare houses of the suburb. But when, at length, a rise of ground had completely concealed from him that odious Paris, when he could believe himself to be 100 leagues distant from it, in the fields, in the desert, he halted, and it seemed to him that he breathed more freely. Then frightful ideas thronged his mind. Once more he could see clearly into his soul, and he shuddered. He thought of that unhappy girl who had destroyed him, and whom he had destroyed. He cast a haggard eye over the double, tortuous way which fate had caused their two destinies to pursue up to their point of intersection, where it had dashed them against each other without mercy. He meditated on the folly of eternal vows, on the vanity of chastity, of science, of religion, of virtue, on the uselessness of God. He plunged to his heart's content in evil thoughts, and its proportion as he sank deeper, he felt a satanic laugh burst forth within him. And as he thus sifted his soul to the bottom, when he perceived how large a space nature had prepared there for the passions, he sneered still more bitterly. He stirred up in the depths of his heart all his hatred, all his malevolence, and, with the cold glance of a physician who examines a patient, he recognized the fact that this malevolence was nothing but vitiated love, that source of every virtue in man, turned to horrible things in the heart of a priest, and that a man constituted like himself, in making himself a priest, made himself a demon. Then he laughed frightfully, and suddenly became pale again, when he considered the most sinister side of his fatal passion, of that corrosive, venomous, malignant, implacable love, which had ended only in the gibbet for one of them, and in hell for the other. Condemnation for her, damnation for him. And then his laughter came again, when he reflected that Phoebus was alive, that after all, the captain lived, was happy, and handsomer doublets than ever, and a new mistress whom he was conducting to see the old one hanged. His sneer redoubled its bitterness when he reflected that out of the living beings whose death he had desired, the young girl, the only creature whom he did not hate, was the only one who had not escaped him. Then from the captain his thought passed to the people, and there came to him a jealousy of an unprecedented sort. He reflected that the people also, the entire populace, had had before their eyes the woman who he loved exposed almost naked. He writhed his arms with agony as he thought that the woman whose form, caught by him alone in the darkness, would have been supreme happiness, had been delivered up in broad daylight at full noonday to a whole people, clad as for a night of voluptuousness. He wept with rage over all these mysteries of love, profaned, soiled, laid bare, withered forever. He wept with rage as he pictured to himself how many impure looks had been gratified at the sight of that badly fastened shift, and that this beautiful girl, this virgin lily, this cup of modesty and delight, to which he would have dared to place his lips only trembling, had just been transformed into a sort of public bowl, whereat the vilest populace of Paris, thieves, beggars, lackeys, had come to quaff in common, in audacious, impure, and depraved pleasure. And when he sought to picture to himself the happiness which he might have found upon earth, if she had not been a young performer, and if he had not been a priest, if Phoebus had not existed, and if she had loved him, when he pictured to himself that a life of serenity and love would have been possible to him also, even to him, that there were at that very moment, here and there upon the earth, happy couples spending the hours in sweet converse, beneath orange trees, on the banks of brooks, in the presence of a setting sun, of a starry night, and that if God had so willed, he might have formed with her one of those blessed couples. His heart melted in tenderness and despair. Oh, she, still she. It was this fixed idea which returned incessantly, which tortured him, which ate into his brain and rent his vitals. He did not regret. He did not repent. All that he had done he was ready to do again. He preferred to behold her in the hands of the executioner rather than in the arms of the captain. But he suffered. He suffered so that at intervals he tore out handfuls of his hair to see whether it were not turning white. Among other moments, there came one when it occurred to him that it was perhaps the very minute when the hideous chain which he had seen that morning was pressing its iron noose closer about that frail and graceful neck. This thought caused the perspiration to start from every pore. There was another moment when, while laughing diabolically to himself, he represented to himself La Esmeralda as he had seen her on that first day, lively, careless, joyous, happily attired, dancing, winged, harmonious, and La Esmeralda of the last day, in her scanty shift, with a rope about her neck, mounting slowly with her bare feet the angular ladder of the gallows. He figured to himself this double picture in such a manner that he gave vent to a terrible cry. While this hurricane of despair overturned, broke, tore up, bent, uprooted everything in his soul, he gazed at nature around him. At his feet, some chickens were searching the thickets and pecking. Enameled beetles ran about in the sun. Overhead, some groups of dappled gray clouds were floating across the blue sky. On the horizon, the spire of the Abbey St. Victor pierced the ridge of the hill with its slate obelisk, and the miller of the Copier hillock was whistling as he watched the laborious wings of his mill turning. All this active, organized, tranquil life, recurring around him under 1,000 forms, hurt him. He resumed his flight. He sped thus across the fields until evening. This flight from nature, life, himself, man, God, everything, lasted all day long. Sometimes he flung himself face downward on the earth, and tore up the young blades of wheat with his nails. Sometimes he halted in the deserted street of a village, and his thoughts were so intolerable that he grasped his head in both hands and tried to tear it from his shoulders in order to dash it upon the pavement. Towards the hour of sunset, he examined himself again and found himself nearly mad. The tempest which had raged within him ever since the instant when he had lost the hope and the will to save the young girl, that tempest had not left in his conscience a single healthy idea, a single thought which maintained its upright position. His reason lay there almost entirely destroyed. There remained but two distinct images in his mind, La Esmeralda and the gallows. All the rest were blank. Those two images united presented to him a frightful group. and the more he concentrated what attention and thought was left to him, the more he beheld them grow, in accordance with a fantastic progression, the one in grace, in charm, in beauty, in light, the other in deformity and horror, so that at last La Esmeralda appeared to him like a star, the gibbet like an enormous, fleshless arm. One remarkable fact is that during the whole of this torture, the idea of dying did not seriously occur to him. The wretch was made so. He clung to life. Perhaps he really saw hell beyond it. Meanwhile, the day continued to decline. The living being which still existed in him reflected vaguely on retracing its steps. He believed himself to be far away from Paris. On taking his bearings, he perceived that he had only circled the enclosure of the university. The spire of Saint Sulpice and the 3 lofty needles of Saint Germain-des-Prés rose above the horizon on his right. He turned his steps in that direction. When he heard the brisk challenge of the men-at-arms of the abbey around the crenellated, circumscribing wall of Saint Germain, he turned aside, took a path which presented itself between the abbey and the lazar house of the Bourg, and at the expiration of a few minutes found himself on the verge of the Pré aux Clercs. This meadow was celebrated by reason of the brawls which went on there night and day. It was the hydra of the poor monks of Saint Germain, quod miacis sanctus Germani, pratinus hydra fruit, clericis nova semper, desiderium capita citandibus. The archdeacon was afraid of meeting someone there. He feared every human countenance. He had just avoided the university and the Bourg Saint-Germain. He wished to re-enter the streets as late as possible. He skirted the Pré aux Clercs, took the deserted path which separated it from the Dieuf Neuf, and at last reached the water's edge. There, Dom Claude found a boatman who, for a few farthings in Parisian coinage, rowed him up the river as far as the point of the city, and landed him on that tongue of abandoned land where the reader has already beheld Gringoire dreaming, and which was prolonged beyond the King's Gardens, parallel to the Ile du Possieur Vache. The monotonous rocking of the boat and the ripple of the water had, in some sort, quieted the unhappy Claude. When the boatman had taken his departure, he remained standing stupidly on the strand, staring straight before him, and perceiving objects only through magnifying oscillations, which rendered everything a sort of phantasmagoria to him. The fatigue of a great grief not infrequently produces this effect on the mind. The sun had set behind the lofty Tour de Nesle. It was the twilight hour. The sky was white. The water of the river was white. Between these 2 white expanses, the left bank of the river, on which his eyes were fixed, projected its gloomy mass, and rendered ever thinner and thinner by perspective. It plunged into the gloom of the horizon like a black spire. It was loaded with houses, of which only the obscure outline could be distinguished, sharply brought out in shadows against the light background of the sky and the water. Here and there windows began to gleam, like the holes in a brazier. This immense black obelisk, thus isolated between the 2 white expanses of the sky and the river, which was very broad at this point, produced upon Dom Claude a singular effect, comparable to that which would be experienced by a man who, reclining on his back at the foot of the tower of the Strasbourg, should gaze at the enormous spire plunging into the shadows of the twilight above his head. Only, in this case, it was Claude who was erect, and the obelisk which was lying down, but, as the river, reflecting the sky, prolonged the abyss below him, the immense promontory seemed to be as boldly launched into space as any cathedral spire, and the impression was the same. This impression had even one stronger and more profound point about it. that it was indeed the Tower of Strasbourg, but the Tower of Strasbourg 2 leagues in height, something unheard of, gigantic, immeasurable, an edifice such as no human eye has ever seen, a Tower of Babel. The chimneys of the houses, the battlements of the walls, the faceted gables of the roofs, the spires of the Augustines, the Tower of Nesle. All these projections which broke the profile of the colossal obelisk added to the illusion by displaying in eccentric fashion to the eye the indentations of a luxuriant and fantastic sculpture. Claude, in the state of hallucination in which he found himself, believed that he saw with his actual eyes the bell tower of hell. The 1,000 lights scattered over the whole height of the terrible tower seemed to him so many porches of the immense interior furnace. The voices and noises which escaped from it seemed so many shrieks, so many death groans. Then he became alarmed. He put his hands on his ears that he might no longer hear, turned his back that he might no longer see, and fled from the frightful vision with hasty strides. But the vision was in himself. When he re-entered the streets, the passers-by, elbowing each other by the light of the shop fronts, produced upon him the effect of a constant going and coming of spectres about him. There were strange noises in his ears. Extraordinary fancies disturbed his brain. He saw neither houses, nor pavements, nor chariots, nor men and women, but a chaos of indeterminate objects whose edges melted into each other. At the corner of the Rue de la Barillerie, there was a grocer's shop, whose porch was garnished all about, according to immemorial custom, with hoops of tin, from which hung a circle of wooden candles, which came in contact with each other in the wind, and rattled like castanets. He thought he heard a cluster of skeletons at Montfaucon, clashing together at the gloom. "Oh," he muttered, "the night breeze dashes them against each other, and mingles the noise of their chains with the rattle of their bones. Perhaps she is there among them." In his state of frenzy, he knew not whither he was going. After a few strides he found himself on the Pont Saint-Michel. There was a light in the window on a ground-floor room. He approached. Through a cracked window he beheld a mean chamber which recalled some confused memory to his mind. In that room, badly lighted by a meager lamp, there was a fresh, light-haired young man with a merry face, who amid loud bursts of laughter was embracing a very audaciously attired young girl, and near the lamp sat an old crone, spinning and singing in a quavering voice. As the young man did not laugh constantly, fragments of the old woman's ditty reached the priest. It was something unintelligible, yet frightful. I am not going to sing, nor am I going to say it in French, but we do have a translation. Bark, Greve, grumble, Greve, spin, spin, my distaff, spin her rope for the hangman, who is whistling in the meadow. What a beautiful hempen rope! Sow hemp, not wheat. From Issy to Vanvres, the thief hath not stolen the beautiful hempen rope. Grumble, Greve, bark, Greve, to see the dissolute wench hang on the bleary-eyed gibbet windows. Our eyes. Thereupon the young man laughed and caressed the wench. The crone was La Fallodeau. The girl was a courtesan. The young man was his brother, Jehan. He continued to gaze. That spectacle was as good as any other. He saw Jehan go to a window at the end of the room, open it, cast a glance on the quay, where in the distance blazed 1,000 lighted casements, and he heard him say as he closed the sash, "Parn my soul, how dark it is! The people are lighting their candles, and the good gods his stars." Then Jehan came back to the hag, smashed a bottle standing on the table, exclaiming, "Already empty, Corbouf! And I have no more money. Isabeau, my dear, I shall not be satisfied with Jupiter until he has changed your 2 white nipples into 2 black bottles, where I may suck wine of Bonneau day and night." This fine pleasantry made the courtesan laugh, and Gian left the room. Dom Claude had barely time to fling himself on the ground in order that he might not be met, stared in the face, and recognized by his brother. Luckily, the street was dark, and the scholar was tipsy. Nevertheless, he caught sight of the archdeacon prone upon the earth in the mud. "Oh, oh," said he, "here's a fellow who has been leading a jolly life today." He stirred up Dom Claude with his foot, and the latter held his breath. "Dead drunk," resumed Gian. "Come, he's full. A regular leech detached from a hog's head. He's bald," he added, bending down. "'Tis an old man." Then Dom Claude heard him retreat, saying, "'Tis all the same. Reason is a fine thing, and my brother the archdeacon is very happy in that he is wise and has money." Then the archdeacon rose to his feet and ran without halting towards Notre-Dame, whose enormous towers he beheld rising above the houses through the gloom. At the instant when he arrived, panting, on the Place du Parvis, he shrank back and dared not raise his eyes to the fatal edifice. "Oh," said he in a low voice, "is it really true that such a thing took place here today, this very morning?" Still, he ventured to glance at the church. The front was somber. The sky behind was glittering with stars. The crescent of the moon in her flight upward from the horizon had paused at the moment on the summit of the light hand tower, and seemed to have perched itself, like a luminous bird, on the edge of the balustrade, cut out in black trefoils. The cloister door was shut, but the archdeacon always carried with him the key of the tower in which his laboratory was situated. He made use of it to enter the church. In the church he found the gloom and silence of a cavern. By the deep shadows which fell in broad sheets from all directions, he recognized the fact that the hangings for the ceremony of the morning had not yet been removed. The great silver cross shone from the depths of the gloom, powdered with some sparkling points, like the Milky Way of that sepulchral night. The long windows of the choir showed the upper extremities of their arches above the black draperies, and their painted panes, traversed by a ray of moonlight, had no longer any hues but the doubtful colors of night, a sort of violet, white, and blue, whose tint is found only on the faces of the dead. The archdeacon, on perceiving these wan spots all around the choir, thought he beheld the mitres of damned bishops. He shut his eyes, and when he opened them again, he thought they were a circle of pale visages gazing at him. He started to flee across the church. Then it seemed to him that the church also was shaking, moving, becoming endued with animation, that it was alive, that each of the great columns was turning into an enormous paw, which was bleeding the earth with its big stone spatula, and that the gigantic cathedral was no longer anything but a sort of prodigious elephant, which was breathing and marching with its pillars for feet, its 2 towers for trunks, and the immense black cloth for its housings. This fever or madness had reached such a degree of intensity that the external world was no longer anything more than the unhappy man than a sort of apocalypse, visible, palpable, terrible. For one moment he was relieved. He was plunged into the side aisles. He perceived a reddish light behind a cluster of pillars. He ran towards it as to a star. It was the poor lamp which lighted the public breviary of Notre-Dame night and day beneath its iron grating. He flung himself eagerly upon the holy book in the hope of finding some consolation or some encouragement there. The hook lay open at this passage of Job, over which his staring eye glanced. "And a spirit passed before my face, and I heard a small voice, and the hair of my flesh stood up. On reading these gloomy words, he felt that which a blind man feels when he feels himself pricked by the staff which he has picked up. His knees gave way beneath him, and he sank upon the pavement, thinking of her who had died that day. He felt so many monstrous vapors pass and discharge themselves in his brain that it seemed to him that his head had become one of the chimneys of hell. It would appear that he remained a long time in his attitude, no longer thinking, overwhelmed and passive beneath the hand of the demon. At length some strength returned to him. It occurred to him to take refuge in his tower beside his faithful Quasimodo. He rose, and, as he was afraid, he took the lamp from the breviary to light his way. It was sacrilege, but he had got beyond heeding such a trifle now. He slowly climbed the stairs of the towers, filled with a secret fright which must have been communicated to the rare passers-by in the Place du Parvis by the mysterious light of his lamp, mounting so late from loophole to loophole of the bell tower. All at once he felt a freshness on his face, and found himself at the door of the highest gallery. The air was cold. The sky was filled with hurrying clouds, whose large white flakes drifted on upon another, like the breaking up of river ice after the winter. The crescent of the moon, stranded in the midst of clouds, seemed a celestial vessel caught in the ice cakes of the air. He lowered his gaze and contemplated for a moment through the railing of slender columns which unites the two towers, far away, through a gauze of mist and smoke, the silent throng of the roofs of Paris, pointed, innumerable, crowded and small like the waves of a tranquil sea on a summer night. The moon cast a feeble ray, which imparted to earth and heaven an ashy hue. At that moment, the clock raised its shrill, cracked voice. Midnight rang out. The priest thought of midday. 12 o'clock had come back again. "Oh," he said in a very low tone, "she must be cold now." All at once a gust of wind extinguished his lamp, and almost at the same time he beheld a shade, a whiteness, a form, a woman, appear from the opposite angle of the tower. He started. Beside this woman was a little goat, which mingled its bleat with the last bleat of the clock. He had strength enough to look. It was she. She was pale. She was gloomy. Her hair fell over her shoulders as in the morning, but there was no longer a rope on her neck. Her hands were no longer bound. She was free. She was dead. She was dressed in white and had a white veil on her head. She came towards him, slowly, with her gaze fixed on the sky. The supernatural goat followed her. He felt as though made of stone and too heavy to flee. At every step which she took in advance, he took one backwards, and that was all. In this way he retreated once more beneath the gloomy arch of the stairway. He was chilled by the thought that she might enter there also. Had she done so, he would have died of terror. She did arrive, in fact, in front of the door of the stairway, and paused there for several minutes, stared intently into the darkness, but without appearing to see the priest, and passed on. She seemed taller to him than when she had been alive. He saw the moon through her white robe. He heard her breath. When she had passed on, he began to descend the staircase again, with the slowness which he had observed in the spectre, believing himself to be a spectre too, haggard, with hair on end, his extinguished lamp still in his hand. And as he descended the spiral steps, he distinctly heard in his ear a voice laughing and repeating, "A spirit passed before my face, and I heard a small voice, and the hair of my flesh stood up." End of chapter 1. Okay, so this chapter, Claude Frollo leaves. So he has already left before Quasimodo has swung down to snatch up Esmeralda to safety. And so he is in his fields and just walking about. Where he's walking, he doesn't know. And he's just walking and is just like, all right, well, she's probably dead by now. I can be free, but I can't really because I'm still thinking about her. And in, another life, I'm not a priest and she's not a bohemian dancer. And her goat isn't a devil and like all of these things. And we're happy together. Like I see other couples sitting underneath orange trees and chatting and having the time of their life. But unfortunately, it's not this life. And so he eventually makes his way back to, oh no, he stops at a tavern and recognizes his brother. And his brother is just super, super drunk and obviously indulging in the flesh. My gosh. And so he doesn't want anybody to see him. He was just like stopping by. And so he like backs up and he leaves and he's continues his walk and he ends up back at Notre-Dame and he's like, you know what? I think maybe I would be comforted by hanging out with Quasimodo. And so he's like making his way up there. He hears the bells. It is now midnight. It is exactly 12 hours since Esmeralda's execution. She's probably cold by now. And then he sees Esmeralda and her goat, but he's convinced that she has already died. So he thinks that he is seeing her ghost. And she steps forward and he steps back, and she steps forward and he steps back. And that's where it ends. And that's where it ends. And that's where we're going to end tonight. It's a good one. It's a good one. Things are happening. I'm excited. I'm enjoying this. And just like Victor Hugo has such a good way of descriptions and words and making you feel things and whatever. Victor Hugo has such a way with like words and everything. Like, yeah, you're gonna be sad, but you're not just gonna be sad. You're gonna be like real sad, real sad. But also, let me give you all of this context so you know just how sad you should be. But that's it. That's it. We done did it today. We'll continue right where we left off next week. I will be on tomorrow doing productivity sprints, reading silently. So if you want to hang out, be productive, or pretend to be productive, that's it. Thank you all for being here so much. It is always a pleasure. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.